Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Anomaly Archives Streamathon. I'd like to introduce our guest, Jeffrey J. Kripal. He's the Associate Dean of the School of Humanities and holds the J. Newton Razor Chair in Philosophy and Religious Thought at Rice University, where he chaired the Department of Religion for 8 years and helped create the GEM program, a doctoral concentration in the study of Gnosticism, Esotericism, and Mysticism that is the largest program of its kind in the world. He is the Associate Director of the Center for Theory and Research at the Esalen Institute in Big Sur, California, where he also serves as chair of the board. He is the author of several books, including The Flip, Epiphanies of Mind and the Future of Knowledge, Secret Body, Erotic and Esoteric Currents in the History of Religions, Comparing Religions, Mutants and Mystics, Science Fiction, Superheroes, Comics, and the Paranormal, and Authors of the Impossible, the Paranormal and the Sacred, as well as Esalen, America and the Religion of No Religion, The Serpent's Gift, Gnostic Reflections on the Study of Religion, and he's also co-edited several other volumes on the history of science, psychology, and analysis of psychical experiences called Seriously Strange, Thinking Anew About Psychical Experiences, as well as On the History of Esalen and the American Counterculture, that's called On the Edge of the Future, Esalen and the Evolution of American Culture, as well as On the Ethical Critique of Mystical Traditions, a title called Crossing Boundaries, Essays on the Ethical Status of Mysticism, and others, including The Supernatural, a New Vision of the Unexplained, which he co-wrote with Whitley Strieber. His present areas of writing and research include the articulation of a new comparativism within the study of religion that will put the impossible back on the table again, a robust and even conversation between the sciences and the humanities, and the mapping of an emergent mythology or super story within paranormal communities and individual visionaries. He has also recently founded the Archives of the Impossible. Welcome to the Anomaly Archives Streamathon. Jeff, how are you doing?
Thanks. That was much too long, by the way.
I tried to shorten it, but there's just so many good things to mention there. You know,
I got exhausted listening to it. It's okay. Thank you.
You're very welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Yeah.
So, as I was saying to you before we started the recording, I have been aware of your work for a long time and am playing catch up on the many books that you've written. I really started with the co-authored book with Whitley Strieber for the obvious reasons that as somebody who's interested, nay, obsessed with UFOs and associated phenomena, Whitley Strieber is one of those figures in the field that just is so iconic and has been controversial, and who I've at times been very enamored with as a storyteller, as well as frustrated with because of just, well, he's Whitley, and so when I heard that you were writing with him, I had to dive into that, and then of course I've been currently consuming the fantastic Authors of the Impossible, which you wrote over, or I guess just about 10 years ago, or it was published 10 years ago.
Yeah.
I'm hoping that you can give us a little insight into what life experiences may have led to the germination of this idea of the founding of this Archives of the Impossible there at Rice University in Houston.
Yeah, so, I mean, it's like all of our lives. That's a complicated question, right? I mean, there's so many streams that come together and flow forward. I've really tried to think hard and be careful about what I can contribute to this field and what I can do, and I've concluded that the best thing I can do is try to insert this topic into the gut of the academy and get it to stick somehow, get it into our colleges and universities and curricula and get young people excited about it and have it last longer than just our generation or just, the next book. So I was not trained to think about these things or write about them or work with people who have had these experiences. I received very classical training in the comparative study of religion in the University of Chicago in the late 80s and early 90s. And I really didn't start thinking about the paranormal or the anomalous until 2005 or so, maybe. So, I spent almost 25 years in the study of religion before I really turned to this stuff. I became fascinated with this topic because of people. it was people, living people, who kept telling me stories that I just found extraordinary and extraordinarily compelling. And I was so struck by how I had studied religion for 25 years and I had really no capacity or even in categories to write about these stories and to think about them in any kind of rigorous or thoughtful way. And so I became really interested in how the universities, the humanities and the sciences had essentially taken all this stuff off the table and essentially erased it, or attempted to erase it over the last 100 years or so. And that's really why I wrote Authors of the Impossible. It was an attempt to try to understand why we can't talk about these things anymore in elite kind of academic circles. I know they're talked about all the time in the public, but they're actually not talked about in academic circles, nor are they talked about in religious communities, at least very well. Nor can you say anything about them if you're a public servant or a politician. So there are all kinds of places in our culture where they're just forbidden. You just can't speak these things. But you can speak these things in other aspects, like, say, the entertainment industry or popular culture or something. So I just became really interested in that. And why is that? And how can we change that? That was really the motivation. And the motivation was really these people who were telling me these often traumatic, heartfelt stories that really changed their lives completely. And I got a bit angry, to be honest, that people were not taking them seriously and were dismissing them or calling them liars or, claiming these were somehow misperceptions or they were fraudulent or something. I found that absurd. And of course, I knew there were frauds and there were misperceptions. That's not the point. The point is that these stories are very consistent and they happen over and over again to people. So, in terms of previous life experiences, again, it was people, but I did have, I'm always asked that question, by the way. People always want to know what goods I've got. And Whitley's famous. I mean, he won't let go of this. He just is always asking me, and I'm like, man, I feel dull compared to you, Whitley. I feel I'm like the warm-up band for the Beatles that nobody can remember. Trust me. And because these people just live in a different world and other things happen to them. But I did have one really dramatic experience in 1989. I was living in Calcutta, actually, working on my dissertation, and I had what most people would call a sleep paralysis experience and some kind of cardiac event, actually, that resulted in an out-of-body or near-death experience that was quite overwhelming and had all of the kind of classic signs of vibration and subtle energies and erotic arousal. And, it could have easily been read as an abduction experience if I was so inclined, but I was not so inclined then. I was embedded in this Hindu tantric world in which it also, by the way, made perfect sense. So, I mean, that's how I interpreted it then, because I had all the categories. And then later, when I heard these stories from, of course, American individuals who were talking about abduction experiences or near-death experiences, I remembered back to my own experience on Calcutta, and I was like, yeah, I get it. I really get it. And so that experience gave me a kind of ear to hear, but it certainly did not make me some kind of expert or some kind of authority on these things. I'm as puzzled as anyone is by them.
So, and I when I've heard that story before, I'm of course curious. Like, so where you were studying, did they have a nice library? Through these life experiences, obviously some people keep journals. Jacques Vallee being a great example, who's given us this great history in the form of his Forbidden Science journals, and but there's so much that gets written in for personal consumption and not necessarily published. But so when studying these tantric practices and whatnot, were there libraries available at those locations for you and other seekers?
Well, sure, but they're almost impenetrable, in terms of a typical skill set that a person who looks like you or me growing up in the South or the Midwest, we don't have the languages, we don't have the cultural background. So that's what I was doing in Calcutta, was trying to acquire some of that linguistic ability and some of that cultural background. And there were just immense reservoirs of folklore and mythology and the stories of saints and gurus. And I mean, it's just overwhelming in these Hindu traditions. So same with the Buddhist or Taoist traditions. I mean, it's just an ocean of this stuff. Of course, framed in terms that are familiar to these Hindu, Buddhist, and Taoist traditions, not our own scientific or science fiction cultures. But I'm convinced they're related. I absolutely am convinced that, Whitley's experiencing what would essentially be a Hindu tantric goddess, in medieval India. I have no doubt about that. I just think the interpretive framework's different, but I think the experience is largely similar.
Well, and that's one of the things that drew me to him originally, was that he seemed, unlike so many that go through these experiences who often latch on to one interpretation because that fits their pre-existing enculturated belief systems, that he was very deliberately, and struggling with it, obviously, to try and look at it through different lenses, and that really, to me, is the mark of somebody who may be able to help us really navigate these experiences in a better way.
Yeah, I mean, Whitley's one of the smartest human beings I've ever encountered. I mean, he's just, I don't know what his IQ is, but it's up there. Lots smarter than I am. And when I read his book, Communion, probably in about 2010 or so, I mean, it was late again, I was really, really impressed because of this reflexivity that you're describing, this ability to take on different interpretive schemes and kind of move through them and not really land on one. That's a really rare thing to see in a writer, but he had it in abundance. And that's really what drew me to Whitley's larger corpus or body of work.
So what were there any other experiences that you feel really set the stage for your ultimately coming up with this idea for the Archives of the Impossible? Of course, obviously, authors of the Impossible 10 years ago must have played a pivotal role. But was there anything even before that?
Well, I mean, this isn't quite the real answer to your question is that, my early work was all on male sexual orientation and mystical experience. And it was completely, what's the right word? I mean, it was completely vilified and censored and assaulted, really, on the early internet in the 90s. And so I learned from day one that certain forms of knowledge come with tremendous political and social and personal costs, and that ideas matter, and that writing can be a dangerous business, and that secrets are secrets often for good reason. The people keep secrets for all kinds of reasons, many of which are quite understandable. And so I think that experience really keyed me into this later work on the paranormal, because I think it's essentially a secret in plain sight, as I call it. And I've really been struck with experiencers over the years. I've learned through long experience that the story they tell me at first sitting is not the whole story. That actually the story's way stranger than what they just told me. And I also know the second or third version they give me is not
right.
It just gets weirder and weirder. And as I said in many interviews, it actually never makes sense. So I just find that intellectually delicious, frankly, but also humbling. And so I think that's a real thing I've taken away from all of this is I'm not sure we'll ever understand it, and I'm not even sure we're capable of understanding. I suspect we're not.
Stranger than we can suppose.
Yeah.
I certainly, from all my reading and research into the wide variety of anomalous experience, Vallee has talked about this again, this both in terms of the self-selecting nature of researcher, the experiencer who seeks out researchers who already they think mimic their own interpretation of the experiences, or and also just self-censoring those stranger aspects, and how the stranger the experience, the less likely they are to report it, and the people they're likely to report it to gets smaller and smaller, like a clergyman, like their priest, and even then maybe not, because they might be afraid of what the priest will tell them, or more practical circumstances, whether they might end up in an institution. This does have a quality of secret knowledge, but I've always felt very strongly that these are the most important stories, and they so inform. They create and foster these mythologies and these belief systems that civilizations rise and fall on.
Yeah.
And I will keep referencing Vallee, because he, to me, is the ultimate realizer of so many of these truths very early on compared to others, that there's really something significant at play here. And if we don't take the time to analyze it and to discuss it without our preconceptions and our fears and ridicule, that we'll never get anywhere. But as you say, we may not be capable of getting anywhere with it. But I'm up for trying a little bit longer. It's been doing this all my life. So
me too.
So you and Diana Walsh Pasulka are two of the people who I really have felt are leading a sea change in society's interfacing with these experiences and the knowledge that comes with them. Obviously, there has been a sea change in the public's mind that's directly the result, since late 2017, of the revelations about this Pentagon program. But obviously, all that sea change and publicity campaign that's resulted has this air of threat identification, literally, while being couched in terms of to the stars for art and education. But what I sense going on with y'all is you're affecting it through academia, and it's unsurprisingly through the departments of religion and the humanities. And I think that is a great counterbalance to this other wave that's happening. And I don't think people really even have a sense yet of the waves that y'all are generating. You have each taught so many people who are then themselves going on and teaching other people, and this network is really, I think, coming together and spreading, and it's largely, again, in the realms of religious studies, but I think it's having a much wider effect. And I think, one of the things that we have on the Anomaly Archives website is a directory of other archives, because there are so few that are specifically focused on this kind of phenomena. But the fact is that there are tons of classic traditional universities, colleges, who have taken on these collections, because a famous famous UFO researcher, went to their university or taught there and that sort of thing. And I think all of this is so important for the preservation and for future generations to research. And this is why I've been just so excited by the fact that you have, with the help of others, founded this new archive of the impossible at Rice University. Could you actually tell us what is the actual foundational story for its founding?
Absolutely. I would put the accent on with others because there is no archival project without lots of help and lots of gifts from others, and particularly our staff at the Woodson Research Center, our director Amanda Folk, and our archivist, and a number of my own PhD students who have really worked tirelessly for years to do the actual archiving, the kind of nitty gritty, put it in a file folder and make sure we can find it kind of work. So Authors of the Impossible, essentially the argument of Authors of the Impossible is that the paranormal works a lot like a language, and that it's trying to communicate a message to us. It's trying to tell a story. And that if you look at paranormal events, what they fundamentally are stories. And the disciplines we have in the university to understand stories are not in the sciences. They're all in the humanities. They all sit in departments of English literature or anthropology or religious studies or history. And so the argument of the book is not that the sciences are unimportant, but that so are the humanities. And these events are fundamentally about meaning, and we should be looking at that and not just be looking for causal mechanisms. So the way the Archives of the Impossible project started, which is named after the book, was actually it started with Jacques Vallee. I was with Jacques in Berkeley in probably the winter of 2017 or 16, somewhere in there, I'm guessing. I have it written down somewhere. And Jacques just asked me point blank if I could help him place his papers at a university library, because he was very concerned about what would happen to these when he passes. And he knew they could fetch a lot of money on the antiquarian book market, but he wasn't interested in that, and he knew they'd be dispersed and essentially disappear. So I did the reasonable thing. I went back to my university, went straight to our archivist and said, hey, can we do this? Don't we have this relationship to NASA, and wouldn't this be a really cool thing to do at Rice? And he was like, yeah, actually, that's a great idea. And we're here to support the research of the faculty. So to the extent you're doing this and training students to do this, this is absolutely what we want to do. So his name was Lee Pecht. And Lee retired a couple of years ago, and Amanda's taken over. But that Woodson Research Center has just been so remarkably supportive. And so Jacques, then we negotiated with Jacques this gift of his, this major gift of his papers, and that caught around. I told Whitley about it instantly, and so then Whitley started to send us stuff, and it just it created this black hole of interest, this kind of gravitas, until we've received now about 10 of these gifts, some of which contain literally hundreds of thousands of documents or objects or pieces of information. And that's been going on now for three years. We do plan to hold a series of webinars and a conference next academic year, so fall of 2021 and spring of 22, opening these archives to the public and trying to bring some colleagues in to think about how to better establish this field. But that's essentially the origin story, Smiles.
Well, I'd heard, as I was saying earlier off air, about Diana's shepherding another researcher's collection because they were concerned that with their passing, that this legacy would be lost. And this obviously, this is sometimes just a person's personal research library collection, like the books that we have on our shelves behind us, and I think that even just that is something to be preserved, just as a way of trying to know the mind of a particular researcher or experiencer. But in a lot of ways, I think more importantly are just the simple the personal correspondence amongst other researchers and other witnesses and experiences. And and there's just so much other ephemera that may not seem significant to the loved one who's going through it after the passing of the person, but which I think very much ends up having a distinct value to future generations. And I'm not a trained librarian, but I've worked in libraries all my life. And we, with the Anomaly Archives, we have on our board of directors and our advisory board current and past librarians and archivists, and there's so much to consider. And Vallee is a great example where, like I mentioned with his journals, he's done that part that is so valuable in and of itself. But of course, he was smart enough and to approach somebody like yourself to preserve the rest of it, the materials that perhaps went into directly writing that, and the other types of materials that one might archive. And there are so many considerations, and I know that there's even been a little bit of at least some controversy about. I remember reading in the current Volume 4 where he mentions, I've seen a document that proves that such and such American agency was doing abduction experiments, alien abduction, like mind control type experiments. And that's such a provocative statement, but coming from him, it carries a lot of weight. And so, people are like, well, where can I go find that? What's that document? And is that in the archives? And lo and behold, this is not uncommon, but in its archives and in negotiating with the estate or the person whose legacy they are taking on, puts in place various parameters for its preservation and its access. And some people don't take kindly to this idea of like putting a moratorium on public access until a certain time has passed, but that's actually very common and understandable, given, again, this type of information.
And that's part of the secrecy I was talking about earlier. I mean, my early work was all about secrecy, religious secrecy, sexual secrecy, and how secrecy works in these esoteric religious traditions. So when I work with the archive, and there is a moratorium, by the way, on the Vallee collection for 10 years. So that actually makes perfect sense to me. That's another form of secrecy, essentially. But it's not complete secrecy, and it's not ultimate or permanent secrecy. It has a time limit, and it's very thought out, and it's to protect the living, essentially. It's to protect people. And so we really we honor that, and I certainly honor that. And I've never written about anyone's anomalous experience that they themselves didn't agree to and sign off on. I mean, I think that's really important, is that we honor people's agency and their own lives. But it's also why to build an archive, because you're protecting these memories, essentially. And I think that's a kind of honoring, too, that would otherwise just be forgotten. And so that's really what it's about at the end of the day, is these memories to and a university archive potentially protects things for centuries. I mean, it's a long haul, and that takes money, and that takes architecture, and that takes systems that are expensive, and universities can afford to do that because they have resources. And so that's not me. That's kind of why the job is sort of effortless. I can go to anyone and say, hey, will you please give us your life work? Because I'm not asking it for me. It's not about me. It's about future researchers and future generations. And what we're offering people is essentially a kind of humble legacy that will continue for generations and generations. So I just think it's wonderful work, Smiles. I kind of stumbled on it because of Jacques, actually. I wouldn't have thought about it. I'm not a very smart guy, but when I hear a smart idea, I'm like, that's a good idea, you know. And when he said that, I was like, whoa, that's a really good idea.
Well, y'all are off to a great start. Jacques Vallee, Whitley Strieber, a former military remote viewer, Edwin May, and
a bunch of declassified stuff from Project Stargate. Gensler was you were mentioning earlier. She wrote a powerful book called The Lure of the Edge, which was on UFOs and religion. Diana Pasulka, of course, was the original recipient of the Densler gift, and then Diana passed it on to us. Larry Bryant is another major donor. Larry just passed away a month, 2 months ago, but we worked closely with his daughter Gretchen, and he actually spent his whole life in the Pentagon, working in the Pentagon, but spent much of his life working with the Freedom of Information Act to try to get, basically UFO files, essentially. And he and Gretchen sent us, I don't even want to know how many documents. It was 100 boxes of material, and I think they're sending more. Gretchen's sending more now. So, I mean, it's just an immense collection. I went and visited Larry years ago when he was still fairly healthy, and he lived in this little house out in Virginia, and it was just, I mean, it looked like an archive in itself. It was just packed to the gills with UFO stuff. And so it's generosity. Larry was concerned about what would happen to his life work, and I understood that, and I wanted to help, and so now it's preserved. And so we have, there's 10 of these gifts, by the way, that range from fairly small gifts to hundreds of thousands of documents.
Well, one of the things that we're doing with the Streamathon is trying to engage with other like-minded, similar organizations, and thus Archives of the Impossible at Rice University. And it's one of the newest, but like I say, it's obviously off to a great start. And another person, Stanley Krippner, who is an old friend of my sister organization, other nonprofit I serve on the board of, called INACS, the Institute for Neuroscience and Consciousness Studies, which I got involved with back in 1999, which is when I first, I guess, met Paul Smith, former military remote viewer, and one of the first events that we did, big events that I helped put on with them, was Stanley Krippner at the University of Texas, and he's just such a wonderful man. But we're reaching out to other archives. We're going to be showing in the Streamathon a video that was produced for the Streamathon by, I'm going to get the name wrong, but it's the provincial archives that have taken on Stanton Friedman's collection, which, you talk about people's homes being their archives being kind of this overwhelming thing. There's a infamous photo taken by Canadian researcher Chris Rutkowski of Stan sitting in the middle of his office, and it's just this crazy mess of material, and now they're trying to make sense of that. But we're going to get an update from them, so I'm really excited about that. And there's and of course we've had on Chris Rutkowski, and who he too has given his collection to the University of Manitoba. And like all archives, and as you were alluding to, it takes not just time and energy, but money. It takes money to preserve those materials, to scan those materials, and to keep them safe in a protected environment. And of course, they're trying to raise funds at the Manitoba University to digitize those materials as well, so to make them even more available to the public. And this is all takes so much time and effort, and So folks should definitely look at the Fondren library. And am I getting the name right? Is it Woodson Fondren?
It's called the Woodson Research Center within Fondren Library. Fondren Library is the big library of Rice University. The Woodson Research Center is essentially the special collections unit or the archival unit within the library.
Gotcha. Okay. And so folks can support that effort as well. There's so much more I want to talk to you about, but I think I may save a deeper conversation about the phenomenon and for later. But I really, in reading Authors of the Impossible, have found so much resonance with my own sensibilities on this subject. It's been very satisfying to feel this kindred thinking between myself and what you've put there. And I the focus on the weird aspect of this phenomena that goes between subjective and objective. And it reminded me so much of conversations that I had with my good friend Susan Lepselter back when she was researching for her dissertation on these uncanny experiences, which she made into this book here.
I know Susan. I met her years ago at the University of Indiana University. Yeah.
She's going to be presenting for the Streamathon, and I love her so much. And we just had so many great conversations back in the 90s at the height of the abduction craze, so to speak. And she was, we were attending these regular experiencer support group meetings and talking about these things. And we started referring to these things as sob stories because they're subjective. They're both subjective and objective. Of course, we weren't the first to think of these ideas.
That's great. No, I never heard that one actually.
Well, it reminds me of Michael Talbot's omnijective, and I don't think he even was the first person to come up with that term. But it's reassuring to know that there's been this continuity of thought amongst academics that really I find so much better than the traditional run-of-the-mill conversations in the UFO community or the paranormal community. Those, as Greg Bishop says, those are my peeps, So I love the circus tent aspect, but the scientist in me is like, well, gosh, it's so it can be hard to rectify these two things, but it's kind of like the subjective and objective. It's hard to kind of find that balance. So.
Greg, yeah, I know Greg too. Actually, Greg's very funny along those lines. But yeah.
Well, in the end, actually, and I was thinking of him rereading my notes on Authors of the Impossible, and in your introduction where you quote John Mack talking about the excluded middle.
Yeah.
Greg Bishop's the name of his magazine from the 1990s, which is how I met him, was through that zine scene in the 1990s. And again, that's what this gets to, is what I'm trying to say about. I think that there needs to be a higher level discourse. And I think you're absolutely a part of that, and more importantly, you're helping preserve that discourse and the background information on it. And I really look forward to talking to you again, and want to thank you so much for taking the time today. And I guess what can folks do to support the Archives of the Impossible?
That's a good question. Well, certainly keep your eyes open. We'll be advertising these webinars, and we're also going to create both a physical exhibition of the archives in the library next fall that'll run probably through from September through December, and then we'll also do a conference probably in January and February. But all these things will be advertised on a website called Opening the Archives of the Impossible. So just look for that, and it'll all be free. It'll all be open to the public, and we'd love as many people to join us as we can. It's for the public, Smiles. I mean, the whole point of an archive is to make things available. It's not to say, hey, look what great things I have, nah. It's like, no, it's like, look at all this work we've done to make this available so that you can come and work in the candy shop, as it were. And
Absolutely. Yeah, no, that's it. The look I see on so many people's faces when they enter the Anomaly Archives or any of these kinds of anomalous archives is that look of like, I've come to Wonderland, and there's just, it's like every book is a different, paradigm to be explored. So.
Yeah, I wrote this book years ago called Mutants and Mystics, which is on the paranormal and popular culture, and I always refer to it as my midlife regression book. I think I went back to about 12, and I'm actually not sure I ever got out of it. I kind of think I'm still there with this archive, somewhere around 12 or 13. It's great. It's fantastic stuff. It keeps us young.
Yeah, it's one of the ones of yours I've really wanted to read. I mean, I just pretty much every book I listed off, and the ones I excluded, I'm like, oh, there's so many I want to read, but that one particularly, because it really goes to the heart of this. These ideas permeate our popular culture so extensively, and in some ways, people still think of them as being childlike or youth oriented, but they are the stuff of myth. They are the foundations of our most deeply held beliefs about the nature of ourselves, the universe, and possible others, whether they be deities or something else. So fascinating stuff. Stay right there. I'll be right back. But folks can go to jeffreyjkripal.com, and we will have links to the Archives of the Impossible at the library there in Rice University. And thank you all so much for joining us today.